This morning we'll be covering 2 Kings chapter 18, and I've distributed new handouts in connection with that. If I overlooked you and you didn't get a handout, raise your hand and I'll try to get one to you. But before we begin, we'll have a word of prayer. Our great and our awesome Father in heaven, we're so thankful once again that we have the opportunity to gather together and to study the Scriptures together as like-minded people of faith. And we pray, Father, that as we look into the life of King Hezekiah and we see the kind of faith that he demonstrated, you'll help us to realize, Lord, that our trust ought not to be in the powers that be in this world or in human solutions to problems, but rather our trust should be in you and in you alone. We should not fear those of this world who would try to blaspheme you or stand against you, but rather we should realize that ultimately they don't have the answer and that you will vindicate all your people on the final day. Pray these things in Christ's name. Amen. All right, 2 Kings chapter 18, and chapter 17 was about how the northern kingdom of Israel fell and was taken over by the Assyrians. They were conquered and they were repopulated by people from other parts of the empire. And so now northern Israel is gone, and we're basically going to focus on just the southern kingdom of Judah, or the rest of the book, which will take us to the end of March. And 2 Kings chapter 18, 19, and 20 are all devoted to the reign of King Hezekiah. And I guess we'll just start by getting the basic summary of Hezekiah's reign in the first 8 verses of 2 Kings 18. Can I get a volunteer to read 2 Kings 18 and verses 1 through 8? All right. So we read that. How is Hezekiah radically different from all the kings that were before him? High places, and that's a big one right here. Hezekiah is very much unlike his predecessors. He did right in the sight of the Lord, unlike his father Ahaz. He did right like David, unlike his great-grandfather Amaziah. I think that's right, great-grandfather. And he tore down the high places, unlike every king of Judah up to this point. And unlike Solomon, even. Hezekiah distinguishes himself by tearing down the high places. What were the high places, by the way? Was it always false gods that they were worshiping in the high places? Sometimes they were worshiping Yahweh falsely. Okay, yeah, and you would have that sort of thing going on. Sometimes they were outside. Sometimes they were in the house. They've uncovered archaeological remnants of elevated places in the house, little miniature shrines. Sometimes there were idols in them. Sometimes they weren't, and they're suspicious that the ones that didn't have idols were used supposedly for the worship of Yahweh. But Hezekiah says, no, we're going to put a stop to this. We're going to tear down the high places. We're going to get rid of these things, and so he finally comes in and cleans house. Up to this point, every single king of Judah, whether he is evaluated as good or evaluated as bad, there's always that qualifier there. That the people continued to sacrifice on the high places. The people continued to not centralize their worship at the temple in Jerusalem. If you remember in Deuteronomy chapter 12, there was a rule about this. In Deuteronomy chapter 12, and I'm going to start in verse 8. You shall not do at all what we are doing here today, every man doing what is right in his own eyes. For you have not as yet come to the resting place and the inheritance which the Lord your God is giving you. When you cross the Jordan to live in the land which the Lord your God is giving you to inherit, and He gives you rest from all your enemies around you so that you live in security, it shall come about that the place in which the Lord your God will choose for His name to dwell, there you shall bring all that I command you, your burnt offerings and your sacrifices, your tithes and the contribution of your hand, and your choice votive offerings which you will vow to the Lord, and you shall rejoice before the Lord your God, you and your sons and daughters, your male and female servants, and the Levite was within your gates, since he has no portion or inheritance with you. In other words, you're not supposed to worship just anywhere. You must worship specifically at the place that the Lord chooses. In the book of 1st and 2nd Kings place great emphasis on the fact that the place which God had chosen, the city which He had chosen for His name to dwell, was Jerusalem, and the place where His name was to dwell was the temple at Jerusalem. If you keep reading, Moses goes on, make it even clearer, be careful that you do not offer your burnt offerings in every place you see, but in the place which the Lord chooses in one of your tribes. There you shall offer your burnt offerings. There you shall do all that I command you. And he goes on to explain about situations where they can slaughter and eat meat versus sacrificing and how those are two different things. But the point remains. You can't worship just anywhere. You can't sacrifice just anywhere. You must sacrifice specifically at the place where God chooses for His name to dwell. The central sanctuary. In those days, the tabernacle. In latter days, the temple. So the high places are technically a violation of that. And that's one way in which Hezekiah is radically different from all the kings before him, in that he actually tries to dig in and deal with this problem. And ironically, what's going to happen is in verse 22, the Assyrians will criticize him for this and say, well, your God's not going to help you. See, Hezekiah's torn down all his high places. Well, we'll talk about that, the significance of that when we get to it. What else does Hezekiah do, by the way? He doesn't just get rid of the high places. Serpent. Bronze serpent from the wilderness. They were calling it Nehushtan, which is a play on both the word for bronze and the word for serpent, which is kind of interesting. But in Numbers chapter 21, in the wilderness, in Numbers chapter 21, the Israelites, they set out, I'm going to start in verse 4. They set out from Mount Hor by the way of the Red Sea to go around the land of Edom, and the people became impatient because of the journey. The people spoke against God and Moses, why have you brought us up out of Egypt to die in the wilderness? For there's no food and no water, and we loathe this miserable food. There's no food, and we don't like the food that we have, in other words. And the Lord sent fiery serpents among the people, and they bit the people, so that many of the people of Israel died. So the people came to Moses and said, we've sinned, because we've spoken against the Lord, and you intercede with the Lord that He may remove the serpents from us. Moses interceded for the people. And the Lord said to Moses, make a fiery serpent, set it on a standard, and it shall come about that when everyone who is bitten, when he looks at it, he will live. Moses made a bronze serpent and set it on the standard, and it came about that if a serpent bit any man, when he looked to the bronze serpent, he lived. All right, so that was in the wilderness. They built this bronze serpent. Anyone who looked at it, it would not die of their snake bites. And it's later appropriated in the New Testament as a type of Jesus. Jesus says, just as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, so the Son of Man must be lifted up so that whoever believes in Him will have eternal life. But, Hezekiah's day, what's going on? They're burning incense. I must have missed that. Where does it say that he told them to keep it? Oh. I don't know. I mean, that would be interesting if he did, but I know there were several things that were said to be put in the tabernacle: the jar of manna, Aaron's rod that budded, and the stone tablets of the covenant. I don't remember the bronze serpent being on the. I got to look that up. I don't remember that one. Huh?
Anyway, I'd like to make that of that. Hey, why don't we have handwritten copies of then we would know what. Well, I think even if we had the autograph, but if we had the autograph copy,
Right. I mean, yes. You mean like today? Okay, well, in the Jesus addresses this idea in the New Testament, actually, in John chapter 4, when he talks about this. The Samaritan woman asks, where do we worship? You all say in Jerusalem, which is true. That was Deuteronomy 12. We say in this mountain, which the Samaritans had a version of Deuteronomy that actually said, worship at Mount Gerizim. And Jesus says, well, in John chapter 4, Jesus said, woman, believe me, an hour is coming, neither in this mountain nor in Jerusalem will you worship the Father. You worship what you do not know. We worship what we know, for salvation is from the Jews. But an hour is coming, and now is, when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth. For such people the Father seeks to be his worshipers. God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and truth. And in this instance, what we're talking about, is something that is going to change necessarily in this Messianic age. Worship is not tied to a physical location. It is not tied to a specific. It's not. This church building is not a temple. It is not in any way the equivalent of the sanctuaries that you saw in the Old Testament age. It's simply just a house constructed so that we have a convenient place to meet together. And we could do the exact same thing outside. We could go to a public park and do the same thing. We could go next door to my house and do the same thing over and over. The location is not what's important. What's important is the Spirit of God, ultimately. And what's important is the truthfulness to it. Well, truth. God's always cared about truth. The idea, people read John 4 sometimes and they say, oh, well, God wants us to worship in a doctrinally correct fashion, which is true, but that didn't change. That was true before Jesus said what he did in John 4. What he's looking at is that, what worship they had in the past is, it's kind of a model. It's a type of something that is to come. But now we have something greater. We have this true worship. Because we don't have a physical temple because, we ourselves are the temple of God. We don't have a physical priesthood because, we don't have a special separate priesthood because we ourselves are priests of the living God. And we don't offer animal sacrifices because we ourselves are supposed to be living sacrifices. And so that kind of idea pervades the New Testament, and you could talk for a very, very long time about it, certainly. Well, yes, of course. There's a sense. Well, no, of course, there is a certain, absolutely. The assembly of the saints, of course, it talks about in 1 Corinthians 14, the edification of believers. One of the best things that believers do to edify one another is to come together to worship God. Worship can be an individual activity. It can be an assembly activity. Edification can't be an individual activity. You have to be in an assembly together to do that. And the best thing to do to edify one another is to come together to worship the Lord together. So there's... And again, we could talk for a very long time about that, but I hope that made sense or cleared everything up. We were talking about Nehushtan, the serpent, the bronze serpent. What we have here, of course, is an instance where by Hezekiah's time, this symbol of salvation has turned into something profane. It has turned into something that the people have been worshiping and burning incense to. And if the people are going to do that, then the idol's got to go. It's got to go away. There's no question about that. No matter how much sentimental value it has. Again, I don't recall God ever telling them to keep it. I got to go back and look that up. If that would make an interesting twist on the story if that was true. But it's interesting how a relic of the Mosaic age has to be destroyed in order for the Mosaic law to be kept. Do people sometimes hold on to things that they shouldn't out of sentimental reasons, and it's getting in the way of the worship of the true God? Oh yeah, it happens all the time, And so it would be good to reflect and see, as a congregation, what are we holding on to that's getting in the way of the worship of the true God and the demonstration of His will? And then think, okay, what sorts of things ought we be willing to let go of? Stuff to consider, anyway. Hezekiah is said to have trusted in God. Verse 5 says there was no king like him before or after. Is that a literally true statement? Literal? There's no king who was as righteous as Hezekiah before him or after him, ever. Is that true? Okay, all right, so David is who we can compare him to, right? What about Jesus? Well, yeah, exactly. What about Jesus? Okay. Well, and here's the really funny thing, is when the Bible uses that kind of statement about more than one person, and if you were interpreting it literally, you'd have to make it mutually exclusive. So for instance, if we skip ahead to 2 Kings 22, 2 Kings 23, in verse 25, it says that before Josiah, there was no king like him who turned to the Lord with all his heart and with all his soul and with all his might, according to all of the law of Moses, nor did any like him arise after him. No king was like Josiah before him or after him in following the Lord. Which is exactly what it says about Hezekiah. Actually, they both took down high places. We're going to go back to that, and you're nitpicking. The point is, here's the hyperbole, of course, that we need to be careful about interpreting statements in the Bible in literal fashion when they are not intended to be that way. It's like Jesus' disciples, thinking he was talking about literal bread. Well, some people would be there, he meant what he said. He said bread, but that's not what he meant. That's the point. God will do that. Mark. Right. Right. 1 Samuel 2, the earth rests on pillars. No, you got to be careful. Yeah, much more so when you go into poetic text, certainly. One reason why I'm always kind of, scratching my head at these scientific foreknowledge claims. You read, people make similar claims for the Quran, but again, it's based on similar poetic statements taken out of context. But that's, now we're on a tangent. No, that's fine. It's good to bring out thoughts. He trusted in the Lord. He clung to Yahweh. He didn't depart from following Him. Yahweh was with him. That's the same thing the Bible says about David. Hezekiah rebelled against the Assyrians, reversing his father's pro-Assyrian policies. And Hezekiah becomes one of the few kings since David to actually defeat the Philistines, which is kind of cool. Now, Chronicles talks a lot more about Hezekiah's reforms, about how he repaired the temple and he cleansed it and he rededicated it. He reinstituted the Passover, which apparently they hadn't been celebrating for a super long time. Hezekiah actually went so far to go up to northern Israel to destroy some of the idols that were there, and also oversaw a huge contribution to rebuilding the temple. So Chronicles talks about all that. Kings devotes most of its attention to Hezekiah's conflict with the Assyrians. But before anything else, we get verses 9 through 12. In the 4th year of King Hezekiah, which was the 7th year of Hoshea, the son of Elah, king of Israel, Shalmaneser, son of Assyria, came up against Samaria, and besieged it. At the end of 3 years, they captured it in the 6th year of Hezekiah, which was the 9th year of Hoshea, king of Israel. Samaria was captured. Then the king of Assyria carried Israel away into exile to Assyria, and put them in Hala and on the Habor, the river of Gozan, and in the cities of the Medes, because they did not obey the voice of the Lord their God, but transgressed his covenant, even all that Moses the servant of the Lord commanded. They would neither listen nor do it. All that Moses commanded. I like that you read that, it just makes it sound like they broke literally every single commandment. Whether or not that's literally the case, I don't know, but they certainly didn't do a good job keeping any of this important stuff. Now, what we got here, first of all, we read this before, didn't we? Back in chapter 17. So why bring it up again? Why talk about the destruction of Samaria a second time? It has an impact, okay, yeah. A lot of stuff in the book that has an impact, certainly, but this is a huge monumental turning point. Let's ask ourselves another question. What happens immediately after it describes Samaria falling to the Assyrians? Where does the text turn its attention to next? Right here in chapter 18. What's the next thing it goes to? They're invading Judah, right? Now, as readers, we kind of put us on the edge of our seat, because if we remember a couple things, we remember that Hoshea broke precedent a little bit too. He did evil, but not as those who were before him. How we interpret that, of course, that's ambiguous. But whatever he did was too little too late. Hezekiah comes in the picture. He institutes a bunch of reforms. Is it going to be, what was true of Hoshea going to be the same of Hezekiah? Will Hezekiah be like Hoshea? Will Jerusalem be made like Samaria? Will Hezekiah's goodness be too little, too late? By bringing up the destruction of Samaria, the author kind of puts us on the edge of our seat a little bit and goes, and because the next thing we read is the Assyrians invaded Judah. What's going to happen to the people of God? Well, let's keep reading. Somebody read down to... it's hard to come up with a breaking point. Verses 13 through 18. We'll start there. Okay, all right. So what happens here? Sennacherib shows up. He sees his 40 fortified cities. His own records tell us that he took 46 cities total. The siege comes on Jerusalem like it did on Israel. And again, as readers, we're kind of on the edge of our seat here. What's going to happen? Hezekiah pays tribute to Sennacherib. Now, that might surprise us a little bit. Ahaz, if you remember, also paid tribute to the Assyrians. Now Sennacherib's doing the same thing. Where does he get the money? He gets the money from the temple, just like Ahaz did. He has to pay 300 talents of silver and 30 talents of gold, a tribute, again, that is mentioned in the records of Sennacherib, the king of Assyria, which we have access to. Hezekiah dips into the temple treasury to pay this tribute. He cuts the gold off the temple doors to do this. Does it look good for Hezekiah here? No! We might wonder, is Hezekiah wavering in his faith a little bit? I don't know. Is he going to be the same as his father Ahaz ultimately? Just another king that gets afflicted before the Assyrians come knocking down the door? Well, now this is where things start to get a little historically dicey, because up to this point, you can take out Sennacherib's records and set it next to the Bible and be like, okay, yeah, this is all going on in sync. But then there's now a divergence here. According to the Assyrian records, Sennacherib was satisfied with this tribute from this man who had defied him and decided he claims, well, I shut him up like a bird in a cage. He boasted about that and then goes home, claiming he had accepted the tribute and that would be enough. The Bible tells a little bit of a different story. The Bible says that Sennacherib decides that he's going to destroy Jerusalem and then gets wiped out when the angel of the Lord shows up and destroys his army. Now, which one keeps the Assyrians more in character? Well, if you know anything about the Assyrians, you know that they didn't like to leave people who rebelled against them alive, or much less on the throne and in charge of the city that rebelled them. And Hezekiah was a ringleader in this rebellion against the Assyrians, as it turns out. Mentions that in verse 7. He rebelled against the king of Assyria and did not serve him. So for Sennacherib to just kind of walk away and be satisfied with being bought off is really out of character. Perhaps the more likely explanation is that he didn't mention that his army was destroyed because the Assyrians don't like to reveal self-damaging information in their records. That would be perfectly in character for him. Now, what happens is Sennacherib sends his officials, Tartan, Rabsaris, Rabshakeh, and whether these are names or titles. Rabsaris means chief of the eunuchs, and Rabshakeh means chief cupbearer, technically. So, those sound like official titles. But Rabshakeh shows up at the conduit of the upper pool and the highway of the fuller's field, which is, if you read Isaiah, coincidentally, where Isaiah had confronted Ahaz in Isaiah chapter 7. And then Rabshakeh gives a big speech, which... I guess we'll just start reading this speech in verse 19. Rabshakeh said to them, "Say now to Hezekiah, thus says the great king, the king of Assyria, what is this confidence that you have? You say, but they are only empty words, I have counsel and strength for war. Now on whom do you rely that you have rebelled against me? Now behold, you rely on the staff of this crushed reed, even on Egypt, on which if a man leans, it will go into his hand and pierce it. So is Pharaoh, king of Egypt, to all who rely on him. But if you say to me, we trust in the Lord our God, is it not he whose high places and whose altars Hezekiah has taken away, and has said to Judah and to Jerusalem, you shall worship before this altar in Jerusalem? Now therefore come, make a bargain with my master, the king of Assyria, and I will give you 2,000 horses, if you are able for your part to set riders on them. How then can you repulse one official of the least of my master's servants, and rely on Egypt for chariots and for horsemen? Have I now come up without the Lord's approval against this place to destroy it? The Lord said to me, go up against this land and destroy it." Okay. Oh, he was an ancient politician. That's one thing that hasn't changed. Politicians are still the way they've always been. Okay, well, let's talk about Rabshakeh's speech here. Okay, does Rabshakeh say anything right? Well, he did get that right. That's a historical fact. He's wrong about his interpretation of that, but... Yes. Yeah, and that's an important point to bring out. Rabshakeh is very critical of the idea of trusting in Egypt. Rabshakeh's speech uses this verb for trust rather profusely. It's translated trust or rely or things like that. It's not a very common word in the historical books, but it's all over this section of Kings. Isaiah really likes the word a lot too, but what happens, of course, is Egypt is this crushed reed. You can lean on Egypt, you can rely on it, but if you lean on it too much, it's going to go through your hand and pierce it. And this is kind of an interesting little visual here. If you read the book of Isaiah, and this whole speech is reduplicated in Isaiah, one of the things Isaiah is very critical of is don't go to Egypt for help. Don't make an alliance with Egypt. Israel had a problem with that. The whole time they're in the wilderness. Oh, we want to go back to Egypt. Egypt was better than the wilderness. Oh, and they get to the promised land, and they're constantly sending to Egypt for help. There's it's Egypt this and Egypt that. Abraham and Lot had problems with Egypt. Israel had problems with Egypt. In the exile days, during Jeremiah and Ezekiel's time, there's that same warning. Don't go to Egypt for help. And the reason they bring this up so much is probably because, they were trying to make an alliance with Egypt. Did Hezekiah try to get the Egyptians to help him? Yes, he did. We know that. For a few reasons, of course. Hezekiah has already called Egypt for help at this point, against Isaiah's counsel. Egypt was moving to help Israel. They never got to Jerusalem. The Assyrians defeated them 20 miles to the west, and they never made it to the city. Egypt wasn't going to help. Yes? Egypt is kind of a tempting, alluring place to go. They were one of the economic superpowers of the world. They had a lot of advantages. Egypt, of course, was making a lot of fancy promises to them and kind of dangling a bunch of gifts in front of them. It was a very fertile land in a lot of ways because it didn't, unlike Mesopotamia, which had this erratic kind of rainfall, Egypt had the Nile. And because Egypt has the Nile, they were always fertile, So whenever Israel's in the wilderness, they're all like, oh, we're in the desert. Everything was better in Egypt because, we at least ate food to the full. Abraham, in times of famine, Abraham goes to Egypt because that's the place you get away from famine. Isaac has to be told not to go to Egypt before he doesn't go. In Genesis 26, whenever Lot looks to the fields of Sodom and Gomorrah, one of the things it says when he chooses those fields is that it was like the land of Egypt. That's what was tempting about it. Egypt kind of in the Bible represents what is alluring to us. What is the human solution to the problem again. And it's the wrong one. It may be alluring, but it's not right. It's the easy way out. It is. And it's the wrong way. Almost always. Now, Hezekiah appears to have called Egypt for help, but Egypt didn't help him because they got defeated by the Assyrians. And what we have here in 2 Kings 18 and 19 is where Hezekiah changes his approach from trusting in Egypt to trusting in the Lord. And that's the real point of this text, is how he trusted the Lord in a critical moment changed everything. Now, Rabshakeh is right. He's right that Egypt isn't going to help them. He's right for the wrong reasons. Isaiah was saying, don't trust Egypt because you should be trusting God. The Assyrians say, don't trust Egypt because we're so much better than they are. And, they won that fight. But then Rabshakeh says something else in verse 22. He says that, oh, you think you're going to trust in the Lord. Didn't you take away his high places? What's wrong with that thinking? Right. Yeah, that sometimes comes up, yeah. True.
Probably according to
Now, Rabshakeh has it wrong. He doesn't get that Hezekiah has torn down the high places, restricted worship to the temple in Jerusalem, because that's what God wanted. The Assyrians don't understand that actually serves Yahweh. That's actually in conformity with his law. The other thing, Rabshakeh also kind of gets on their case in verses 23 and 24 about how they don't have any manpower. He says, I'll tell you what, you don't need to call Egypt for help. We will give you horses. We will give you chariots. Let's see you put people on them. I don't think you can do it. He says, we'll give you horses, and you put riders on them, and then we'll have a big fight. You don't have to go to Assyria for help. So he's kind of mocking their manpower a little bit here. The Assyrians, again, are being rather cruel. And then in verse 25, he throws one more wrench in the mix. He says that Yahweh's really on our side. He's really on our side. Sennacherib tells them that Yahweh has actually sent him, has actually told him to destroy the land. Now, before we dismiss that out of hand, is there anything to that? Yes, okay, so God has done that, and he explicitly says in the book of Isaiah that he has done that with Assyria. He calls Assyria the rod of his anger, the tool that he uses to discipline Israel. He sent Assyria against Israel in chapter 17. And, it's likely that he sends them against Hezekiah here in chapter 18 as well. So there is that element. Does Sennacherib believe what he says here, though? Who knows, right? Now, if we stop at verse 25, okay, Rabshakeh's got a few flaws in his logic, but he's still presenting his case. But he doesn't stop there. He has more to say. Mark.
Quite possible.
Right. Did God change his mind in the course of this conflict and decide to spare Judah? It might be that way, actually. But although God changing his mind is more explicit in chapter 20 whenever he heals Hezekiah's illness. More on that in a week or two. All right, so we get to the... But here's where diplomacy really starts to go wrong. Let's look at start in verse 26. Eliakim the son of Hilkiah and Shebna and Joah said to Rabshakeh, "Speak now to your servants in Aramaic, for we understand it. Do not speak with us in Judean in the hearing of the people who are on the wall." Which, Aramaic was the diplomatic language. It was the language that everybody kind of knew, and Judean was more the local language. Well, Rabshakeh, of course, uses his knowledge of the Judean, or Hebrew, I guess, really, to kind of demoralize everybody who's listening and undermine Hezekiah's authority. Rabshakeh said to them, has my master sent me only to your master and you to speak these words, and not to men who sit on the wall, doomed to eat their own dung and drink their own urine with you? Brutal. Then Rabshakeh stood and cried with a loud voice in Judean, saying, "Hear the word of the great king, the king of Assyria. Thus says the king, do not let Hezekiah deceive you, for he will not be able to deliver you from my hand. Nor let Hezekiah make you trust in the Lord, saying, the Lord will surely deliver us, and this city will not be given into the hand of the king of Assyria. Do not listen to Hezekiah, for thus says the king of Assyria, make your peace with me, and come out to me, and eat each of his vine, and each of his fig tree, and drink each of the waters of his own cistern, until I come and take you away to a land like your own land, a land of grain and new wine, a land of bread and vineyards, a land of olive trees and honey, that you may live and not die. But do not listen to Hezekiah when he misleads you, saying, the Lord will deliver us. Has any one of the gods of the nations delivered his hand from the hand of the king of delivered his land from the hand of the king of Assyria? Where are the gods of Hamath and Arpad? Where are the gods of Sepharvaim, Hinah and Eva? Have they delivered Samaria from my hand? Who among all the gods of the lands have delivered their land from my hand? But the Lord should deliver Jerusalem from my hand. Oh boy. Now, why does Rabshakeh refuse to speak in Aramaic? He wanted the people to hear what he said. He is, they're saying use the diplomatic language. Rabshakeh says, my mission is not diplomatic. And he uses crude and shocking language to brutalize and terrorize the people. During the siege, they will eat their own waste because of their desperate hunger. And everybody on the wall, I want to make sure everyone on the wall knows this. He says, don't trust in Yahweh. Now this is where Rabshakeh kind of changes his tune a little bit. Up to this point he had been saying, oh, well Yahweh has sent us against you. Now that's not what he says anymore. What's he say instead? Yeah, exactly. Right. And this is the shift in the rhetoric, is it's no longer Yahweh has sent us to destroy you. It's Yahweh couldn't stop us if he wanted to. Yeah. True colors are showing, absolutely. And Rabshakeh abandons this tactic and goes for blasphemy. Don't let Hezekiah trick you. Almost every turn in this section, Rabshakeh is undermining Hezekiah's leadership. Verse 29, do not let Hezekiah deceive you. Verse 30, do not let Hezekiah make you trust in Yahweh. Verse 31, do not listen to Hezekiah. Verse 32, do not listen to Hezekiah when he misleads you. He also repeats the word deliver over and over. I mean, his speech is kind of a rhetorical masterpiece in some ways, and it's also very evil in others. Hezekiah can't deliver, verse 29. Yahweh can't deliver, verse 30. No other God has delivered their nation from us, verse 31. The gods of Samaria didn't even deliver them, verse 33. No other gods have delivered, so Jerusalem will not be delivered, verse 34. Which is kind of interesting. He doesn't bring up that Samaria was supposed to be worshiping the same God as Judah in the first place. But Rabshakeh does something else too. He makes a promise to the people in verses 31 and 32. What does he promise them? And you see the appeal of that, of course. A promised land from the Assyrians. And even what's he trying to do here, though? Surrender, right? It's so much easier than having a 3-year siege, right? I mean, let's face it. You know, would you rather eat from your vines and fig trees and drink well waters, or would you rather eat your dung and drink your urine? Because that's the choice that Rabshakeh is offering. Now, is there any legitimacy to the promises that he's making here? Nope. And it says that. Assyria was brutal to their captives. They used to stick hooks in people's noses and in lips to drag them around. And that's about the reaction that you get when you hear these things, the kinds of things they would do to lead people captive. And of course, in chapter 19, God's going to make a play on this and talk about how he's going to put his hook in Sennacherib's nose and drag him back to the way in whence he came. And that's in chapter 19 and verse 28, because he kind of takes the Assyrian tactics and throws them back in their face. The Assyrians were brutal. And then, of course, Rabshakeh asks the final question, by the way, where are the gods of all the other places we conquered? Other gods couldn't beat us. Why should your God be any different? Now, we could bring up this point too. Why didn't God deliver Samaria? Was it because he was too weak to defeat the Assyrians? What was the real reason? Judgment. Exactly. Samaria wasn't given up because the Assyrian gods were somehow stronger than Yahweh. Samaria was given up because Yahweh had determined that the Assyrians would conquer it. As he says later in chapter 19, have you not heard? Long ago I planned it that you would conquer all these kingdoms.
Rest of the prophet up here. Well, Hezekiah God.
Right.
Prophet.
And this kind of talk here is what leads to Assyria's downfall. And we're going to see more of this next time when Sennacherib sends a letter that basically says the same stuff. Chapter 19. This is going nowhere. Right? I mean, sometimes God uses a more wicked nation to judge a less wicked nation too. That's the point of Habakkuk, or at least one of the points that he offers there. Yeah, but it's one thing to claim that Assyria is God's instrument, like he does in verse 25. It's another thing to claim that God can't deliver. It's not a good idea to start to base your arguments on things that Yahweh can't do. He can do pretty much anything he wants. And that's what led to the Aramean downfall, whenever they said, oh, their gods are gods of the hills, our gods are gods of the plains, so let's just change the battle location. God says, I'm not tolerating that blasphemy. They're going to lose on the plains too. It's the same thing here. God's not going to tolerate the blasphemy of the Assyrians. He hears what gets said. And if Assyria had a chance of winning before, they have no chance of winning now because they dared boast against the sovereign Lord of hosts. And that is the real takeaway that we get from this, is Rabshakeh's argument from history fails to take the Lord of history into account. The chapter division isn't very good here. I'll just read verses 36 and 37. The people were silent and answered not a word, for the king's commandment was, do not answer him. Eliakim the son of Hilkiah was over the household, and Shebna the scribe of Joah, the son of Asaph the recorder, came to Hezekiah with their clothes torn, and told him the words of Rabshakeh. How Hezekiah responds, and how Israel responds, and how God responds. We'll get into that next time, Lord willing.